I've been working on this project on and off for about 10 years, and I probably have gone too far in my pursuit of absolute perfection. But to start at the beginning, my particular hobby is film photography, which involves collecting interesting cameras, taking photos, printing pictures and so on. But within this fairly common hobby, I have a particular niche interest, which is tracking down and trying out cameras which feature in films and media. Now, there are thousands of films which feature cameras, just in an incidental or fleeting way, and maybe tens where cameras or photography are an integral part of a scene, and perhaps contribute to the story in a small way. But only a few films I've ever seen in which a camera plays what you might call a starring role alongside the protagonist. And for this video I'll be talking about easily the most iconic appearance of a camera in film, the camera we see in Alfred Hitchcock's 1954 film Rear Window. Now, if you don't know, Rear Window is the story of a professional photographer who is confined to his apartment for several months, having broken his leg in a photography-related accident. Bored out of his mind, with nothing else to do, he begins to pass the time by watching his neighbours through the rear window of his apartment. And in order to watch more closely, he brings out a particularly attractive camera with telephoto lens, which is his constant companion for the rest of the film. Now, the film deals with ideas like privacy, perception, voyeurism and so on, and as someone interested in photography and the history of photography, I've always been a big fan. And basically, as soon as I first saw Rear Window, I wanted to try to find out the model and make of the camera, and to replicate and try out James Stewart's character's setup. So I'm going to take you through the journey of tracking down the lens and camera, and then go out and take some photos. So it's a particular camera and a particular lens that I'm looking for, and I'm going to start by looking at the camera. So not only does the camera have a lot of on-screen time where it's very clearly visible, there were also a lot of high-resolution publicity stills taken for the movie, which feature James Stewart in costume posing with the camera, which I was able to find. And after a bit of research, looking at these images for reference, I found out that the camera is this. An Exakta VX 35mm SLR made by the Ihagee company out of Dresden, East Germany in the mid-1950s. Now, as I became more and more invested in this project, I also became more and more interested in the Exakta line of 35mm SLRs, and eventually I actually collected all 8 of the major models and variations. And I'll just quickly run through them now. So we start off with the Kine Exakta, introduced in 1936, the Kine Exakta II, 1949, the Exakta VX, 1950, the Exakta VX, which is our rear window camera, introduced in 1951, the Exakta VX 2A, 1956, and the first big cosmetic overhaul of the Exakta, the Exakta VX 2A version 2, 1960, the Exakta VX 2B, 1963, and the final Exakta made was the Exakta VX 1000, 1967. Now, there are several reasons that I first became so interested in the Exakta line of cameras, like their unique design and build quality, but there's also the great historical importance of Exakta. And before I go on to talk about the rear window camera, I'll just explain a bit about why Exakta is so important to the history of photography by talking a little bit about this. The first 35mm Exakta, the Kine Exakta, first introduced in 1936. So you'll notice that the Kine Exakta has almost all the features that became iconic of Exaktas, like the trapezoidal shape, and the fact that the shutter release button, the shutter speed dial, and the film advance lever are all on the left-hand side of the camera as you're taking a photo, which today looks very unusual. But to tell the story of the camera fully, I first have to go back to 1889, when 35mm film was first invented. Now, we all know 35mm film, so called for its width, today as the default type of film used in film cameras. But when 35mm film was invented in 1889 by William Dickson and Thomas Edison, it was originally only for use in cine cameras, for making movies with. It was only decades later, in 1925, that lens technology had really advanced enough for 35mm stills cameras to be really viable. And this is the very first 35mm stills camera of all, the Leica 1. And while it could be said to be the first modern camera, and perhaps the most important camera of all time, it is, as you might expect, quite basic in its functions. In terms of controls, all you have are dials for focusing, aperture, and 7 shutter speeds, and for composing your image, just the very simplest type of viewfinder. And it was only about a decade later, in 1936, that Exakta would make the next big step in the development of modern cameras, with the first 35mm single lens reflex camera, or SLR. And I'll just briefly explain what an SLR is. So it's the type of camera where directly behind the lens you have a mirror held at 45 degrees, and directly above the mirror you have a ground glass screen, which is used for focusing and composing your image. And that's what the real benefit of SLRs is, that you get the most accurate possible preview of the final photo, because you're looking directly through the lens that's about to take the picture. And then when you do press the shutter release button, the mirror flips up out of the way, and the shutter triggers, exposing your film. Now, SLR cameras had first been invented in the 1860s, and since then had become fairly widespread. The real genius of the Exakta design, though, was the miniaturization of the SLR concept, combined with the convenience of 35mm film, plus the new high-quality lenses that meant you could get a decent image from a 24x36mm negative. As well as all this, though, there were a number of other smaller innovations introduced with the Kenner Exakta that made it particularly successful. For example, it was the first camera with a film advance lever, which allowed you to wind on the film with a single stroke. With most other cameras of the period, you advance the film by turning a knob. It was also one of the first cameras with a quick-release bayonet mount, which allowed you to swap out lenses much more quickly than with the normal screw mount. It also just had an unusually nice, bright viewfinder. And in the decades after the release of the Kenner Exakta, the 35mm SLR, making use of many of these innovations, would become the default camera type. Now at this point you may be wondering what exactly went wrong. Why did the Exakta line of cameras fail? And why isn't Exakta as well known as Leica is today? Well, to explain that, I'll now bring out the last Exakta that was made, the Exakta VX 1000, made from 1967 to 1970. Now, while it may look a bit more modern, and even a bit more advanced than the Kenner Exakta, in reality most of the changes are superficial, and looking down at the two Exaktas, you can see that the controls are identical, no real additions, no real changes. The reality is that in 35 years there had only really been one or two very minor improvements to the Exakta. Now, one reason for the lack of innovation was that the real genius behind the Kenner Exakta, Carl Nusterlein, was killed near the end of World War II, and another reason was just difficulties associated with operating a business in East Germany, which is where the E-Hagi company, based in Dresden, the makers of Exakta, found themselves situated after the end of World War II. And comparing this last Exakta to the much more advanced 35mm SLRs that were coming out of Japan in the 60s and 70s, with their through-the-lens metering and motor drives, it's clear that by the early 70s the Exakta had become obsolete. By going back to the mid-1950s, it was the real height of Exakta's success and dominance of the SLR market, and the latest Exakta camera was this, the Exakta VX, or just Exakta VX. And I do think it's one of the most beautiful cameras ever made. So this was the very first Exakta VX I bought to try to replicate the rear window camera, and I have it here with one of its standard lenses, the Biotar 58mm f2. But unfortunately, as I compared the camera more and more with the camera in the movie, I soon discovered that although I had the correct model, the VX, the camera in the film was actually a slightly different version. It turned out that my camera was one of the European versions of the VX, while what I needed was actually one of the US specific versions. And so what I bought next was this from eBay America, which proved to be the correct version. And although, while they're side by side, they do look pretty much identical, if I instead flip between images of the two cameras, you should begin to see a few of these small differences. And I'll just quickly mention a couple of the largest of these differences. So I have the first Exakta VX I bought on the left there, the incorrect European version, and on the right a close-up of one of the publicity stills. So first of all, there is one really obvious difference between both my cameras and the camera in the movie, and that's just that while both of my cameras have a nameplate that says Exakta, the actual rear window camera just has a piece of black leatherette in its place. And that's nothing to do with different versions, of course. It's just something that the props people, I guess, added to the camera to obscure the branding. And I have a piece of black leatherette here, which I'm going to use later to replicate this. But moving on now to actual differences. Firstly, you can see that just below the nameplate on the European version, where it says Exakta VX, there's this little V and X. Exakta VX being the full name of the model. And on the rear window camera on the right, no little VX beneath the nameplate. And if I bring in my American version of the camera, you can see it's the same. The word VX has been removed, and the VX has been pushed up onto the nameplate. And apparently the reason for this difference is just that the word VX was trademarked by someone else in America. And so in America, the Exakta VX was just called the VX. And the other difference I'll mention is that on my European camera, this area is slightly wrong. And in particular, there's this strange wheel or knob that's missing on the rear window camera. And then on the US version, no wheel in that spot. And with a close-up view of the area, the differences become more obvious. And I'll get more into the functions of the camera later on. I'll just say now that the wheel is for setting the shutter counter to 1 when you're starting a new roll of film, while on the American version, which is actually the earlier version, you just have this little cutout area beneath the shutter counter, and you change the number like this. So we've now established that this particular American version of the camera is definitely the correct one. Unfortunately though, I decided I wasn't quite happy with the condition of the camera I had. Just small things like missing paint, chewed up screw heads, and ideally I did want a camera that was in as good condition as possible to match the rear window camera. So I bought another one, but again found a few small faults, especially corrosion on some of the chrome parts. And with camera number 3, again many of the fastenings were quite badly chewed up. And camera number 4 had damaged leatherette. But fortunately the 5th camera I bought was actually in very good condition. No damage or marks at all really. It appears to be almost unused. But now that I have 5 of these cameras, I'll just mention a couple of interesting things. So they all have serial numbers which start either with 69 or 72, which seems like maybe all these are from 2 distinct batches, made especially for US export. And it also signifies that these cameras were made from 1951 to 1953. They also each have this yellow sticker, which just says that these cameras were made for exclusive factory distributors in America. And surprisingly, all of these cameras appear to be fully working, although I can't be sure without testing them with film. So now that I have my ideal rear window Exakta, I'll now run through its basic functions. So looking at the front, as I've mentioned before, you've got the shutter release button in this extremely odd location, which takes a bit of getting used to. And then looking from above, you have all the main controls. So on the left, there's the frame counter adjustment wheel, the shutter speed selector knob, shutter release, and the film advance lever, which you do have to turn unusually far. And you have options on this knob for everything from a 25th all the way up to a 1000th of a second, and it is an extremely satisfying camera to use. And there's one little detail that I especially like. So if you look at the frame counter there, you can see it advancing the instant I take a photo, whereas with every other camera ever made, the counter only advances when you wind on the film, which means technically the counter is not accurate until the film is wound on. And so I really like Exakta's attention to detail here, and it does make the camera especially satisfying. And the only other control here is the slow speeds and self-timer knob here, and to use the knob first I check it's fully wound, and to switch the camera over to slow speeds I have to select the B setting, and now the black numbers are your slow speed options, and the red numbers are your self-timer options. And so I'll select a shutter speed of 1 second, and again it's extremely satisfying. And now on to unloading and loading the camera. Now there's no film in the camera at the moment, but if you imagine that I've just finished a roll of film, I'd first flick up the rewind switch there, then press in this button and turn this knob until all the film is back in the cassette and I no longer feel any resistance. And you open the back by pulling down on this knob, and opening it up you can see a very odd feature which all Exakta cameras have. So if you look at this little handle here that you can unscrew and pull, there's this little blade you can use to cut the film. And this gives you the option of having an empty second film cassette in the camera, which the film is wound onto as you take pictures. Then at the end of the roll, you cut the film, open the back, and just remove the second cassette. And this just saves you from having to rewind the film into its original canister when you finish a roll of film, although I don't think this was ever a very popular feature. But now on to loading the camera with film. So I first pull out the rewind knob, and I'm using Kodak Gold 200 here. And then you'll notice the film goes into the right side of the camera and is pulled to the left, which is the reverse of every other film camera. I then push the end of the film into the take-up spool, then replace the take-up spool and make sure the sprocket holes are engaged with the sprockets. Then closing up the back, and I'm going to wind on the film a couple of times and set the exposure counter to 1. And we're ready to take photos. And now, the last detail about these cameras that I have to mention is their interchangeable finders and focusing screens. So while early Exaktas just had a built-in waist level finder, in 1950 interchangeable finders were added to the Exakta line, allowing you to shoot either with a waist level finder or the more advanced pentaprism finder, which is the type you see here. And so to remove a finder, I just press down on this release and lift it out. And this is a selection of some of the different Exakta finders. And as I said, you have 2 main types. These 5 are all pentaprism finders, and this is the waist level finder. So obviously the camera in Rear Window had a prism type finder, and apart from this style of finder with the leatherette on top that was introduced a few years later, any of these pentaprism finders would be a good match for our Rear Window camera. The only real differences between the rest of these prism finders are very small things which are under the surface. An example would be how, while most finders just have text saying Germany or Made in Germany on them, this finder here you can see says USSR occupied Germany. And I don't think I've seen that before on any other East German cameras. But moving on, unfortunately just like with the cameras, finding a finder in decent condition did take a while. They're often dented, damaged, or have optical problems. I did find a couple in good condition though. So now onto focusing screens. There were several different screens available for Exakta cameras, each one useful for different applications. And I have 2 here, a split image rangefinder type screen on the left, and plain ground glass on the right. Now when in the film we see James Stewart's point of view looking through the camera, we don't see any centre spot or hairline cross, so just the plain ground glass screen is the obvious choice. And to install the screen, you just press it into the finder like this, and then just press the finder into the camera. Now the final thing to do on the camera is to add some covering to the nameplate, like I mentioned earlier. So what I'm going to do first is get a piece of masking tape, and just rub it over the whole nameplate area. And when I peel it off, you can see it's retained the outline of the nameplate, and I'm going to use this as a template. So I have this piece of black leatherette here, which as far as I can tell is what they used to cover the nameplate in the film, and I can stick my template to it and start cutting. And I found these plates which have the right curves I need, which I'll use as a guide for the scalpel. So this large plate for the outer curve, and a smaller plate for the inner curve. And then I can finish it off with a ruler. And finally, peeling off the tape, it looks pretty good. I'm then going to spread some glue over the back, and carefully stick it down. And as you can see, it now looks just like the camera that appears in the film. So now that I have my perfect camera, the next step is to try to find the lens. And it's going to be exactly the same process as finding the camera. Looking at the publicity stills, doing a bit of research online, looking through a few old catalogues, and just rewatching the film. I eventually found out I was looking for a 400mm f5.6 lens, made in Munich, so West Germany this time, in the mid-1950s, by the lens maker Kilfitt, known in the 1950s and 60s for its high-quality telephoto and macro lenses. Now, just like with Exakta, over the course of this project, I got more and more interested in Kilfitt, and over the years ended up with quite a few lenses. Now, these three lenses at the bottom are my real relevant lenses, and are my attempts at acquiring the most accurate possible rear window lens. And I'll explain in a minute why I had to get three. And at the top I have this very nice 400mm f4, which was the premium extra fast version of my rear window lens, and I think one of the most beautiful lenses ever made. And finally I have this slightly cheaper 300mm f5.6 lens, all in its original packaging. Now, unlike with Exakta, with Kilfitt it wasn't so much the history or the historical importance of Kilfitt that interested me. It was much more their design, build quality and attention to detail that made me want to collect Kilfitt lenses. And to demonstrate what I mean by build quality and attention to detail, I'll just show you what the unboxing experience of this 300mm f5.6 lens would have been like in the early 1960s. So we start off with these depth of field tables, which just tell you the range of what will be in focus at different settings of the aperture and focus rings, so not too interesting. And then picking up the lens itself, it's quite heavy, you can immediately tell it's very high quality. But what's more interesting than the lens is what else was included in the box. So one thing that confused me at first was this object in a tiny leather case. And opening it up, you can see it's a tiny jeweler's loupe. And you might wonder why a loupe would be included in the box with this lens. Well, to answer that, I have to look in this little red folder here. And looking at the contents, first we have a couple of little leaflets titled How Kilfitt Tests Lenses. And wrapped in tissue paper here, we have this very mysterious glass plate. And to understand what it is, we can look at the leaflets. So we have one in German and then an English translation. And reading through it, it turns out it's an exhaustive description of all the quality checks Kilfitt does on every individual lens it sells. And where the glass plate comes in is in the final test, the photographic test. So for every lens they use a specialised camera to take a series of photos of various test patterns. Each horizontal strip on the plate is a separate photo, and they do all these tests on two glass plates. One glass plate goes to the purchaser, the other is retained by the factory. And then you can use your tiny loupe to carefully inspect the glass plate yourself. Although I don't particularly know what you're supposed to be looking for. I think it's more supposed to be just a tangible proof that Kilfitt does do all these detailed tests with every single lens they sell, which is extremely impressive, especially considering this particular lens was one of the cheaper lenses Kilfitt sold. But now back to my rear window lenses. So this one was the first one I purchased from eBay America, and just like every other Kilfitt lens I have, it's quite heavy and obviously extremely high quality, but also quite basic in its features. So we have the aperture ring here, 5.6 all the way to 45, the focusing ring, which as you can see moves the whole front half of the lens, and then there's a drop-in gelatin filter holder here. And that's about it. And there it is in the catalogue, by the way. And you can see that it cost just over $250 in the early 60s, which apparently is the equivalent of $2,500 today. So in its time, a pretty premium lens. And just as an aside, there was something extremely interesting about this first lens I bought, which I only discovered when I unscrewed this front section for cleaning. So on this side you can see all the standard stuff. Heinz Kilfitt München, Fern-Kilar, 5.6, 400. But turning it over, you can see that someone has scratched into the metal the word NASA and the number 28633. Now I can't think of any reason anyone apart from NASA would want to scratch this onto the inside of this lens. I did import the lens from America, It's also from the early 60s, which is prime Apollo program, so who knows what this lens might once have photographed. But screwing the lens back together, I'll now get back to Rear Window, and the reason I ended up with 3 of these lenses. So if you remember that the camera I first purchased turned out to be a slightly different variation of the camera that we see in Rear Window. Well, it wasn't long after I purchased my first lens that I realised that unfortunately exactly the same thing had happened again. My lens was a very slightly different variation of the lens we see in the movie. And I'll now bring in lens number 2 to explain. And I'll be very brief with this, as I know it is a bit dull. So at first glance, these 2 lenses may look basically identical, but there are in fact a few small differences. So you can see, for example, the ends of the lenses there are very slightly different. And if you look at the focusing rings, you can see that there are little lines leading up to the numbers on this lens, whereas on the other lens you have just the numbers. But the biggest difference, and the one which best allowed me to identify which of these lenses was the movie-accurate version, you can see if you look now just at the end sections of each lens. So you can see that on my second lens here, the end section has a gloss finish, while the rest of the lens is matte, while on my first lens, the whole lens has the same matte finish. Now, looking at a clip of the film, you can see it's very clear. The end section of the lens has a glossy finish, which is easily distinguishable from the rest of the lens, which has a matte finish. So we can now be certain that it's this lens with the glossy end section that is the correct version, while my first lens, the fully matte one, was a different version, I believe released a few years later. And from all the research I've done, I'm fairly certain that the 2 variations of this lens that I have here were the only ones that Kilfitt ever released. But there is still one more lens, and the reason I had to acquire this 3rd lens is the same reason I acquired so many cameras. I had an issue with their condition. Now, while I was very happy with the condition of the main bodies of my lenses, unfortunately I wasn't so happy about their optics. And if we look closely at the glass of lens number 2 now, you can see that there's this odd pattern just on the surface of the glass. And then if we look at my first lens, you can see it's the same thing, just this mottled effect on the surface of the glass. Now, there are all sorts of things that can go wrong with old lenses: fungus, haze, separation, and so on. But what this strange mottled pattern is the anti-reflective coating on the lens deteriorating. And unfortunately, most of the Kilfitt lenses I've seen have this same issue. And while it shouldn't really affect image quality too much, it does look pretty ugly. So luckily I was eventually able to find lens number 3, which, as you can see, looks to be in much better shape than the other 2. So much cleaner, and without that mottled look. And for comparison, there's lens number 1 again, lens number 2 now, and back to lens number 3. So you can see that lens number 3 is in much better condition than the other 2, and I think it's probably about as good as you could reasonably get for a lens that's around 70 years old. So now that I have my perfect lens and perfect camera, I can finally get on to taking some pictures. But there is one final problem. So you'll notice that at the end of the lens, you just have this screw thread, while you'll remember Exakta lenses have this bayonet mount. And the fact is that Kilfitt telephoto lenses were all sold like this, and you would have to buy a special adapter which would adapt the particular lens to your particular system. Whether this be Alpa, Arriflex, Nikon, Visiflex 1, Visiflex 2, C-mount, or whatever. And each adapter has its own codename, and there are various tables where you can look up the adapter you need. Now, these are all the adapters I've acquired over the years, and so for example this is the Kizex adapter, which came attached to the first lens I bought, and it adapts these lenses for use on Arriflex 16mm cameras. And actually I was looking through this Arriflex brochure from 1957, and found this advert for Kilfitt lenses, and you can see my 400mm lens there in the middle. Now, the other 2 adapters I have took a long time to track down, and are 2 different versions of the adapter for Exakta with the codename Kizex. So either of these would work for my setup, but to find the movie accurate one we have to refer to the movie again, and this is the clearest shot of the adapter that we get. And if you just look at the connecting part between the camera and the lens, It just looks like a slim, nondescript tube. But from watching over clips of the movie several times, I'm sure now that this bulkier adapter is the wrong adapter, and this slimmer one is correct. And to install it, I just screw it onto the end of the lens, and I can finally fit the lens onto the camera. And we are now completely finished. It's looking very good, and I think this is as close to the camera used in the movie that I'm ever going to get. And we're finally ready to go out and take some photos. So I have a couple of locations and subjects lined up to test the setup with, but as wildlife photography is one of the classic uses for telephoto lenses, for obvious reasons, we're in the garden now to try to take some pictures of birds. And you should be able to see right in the centre of the frame a bird feeder, which we're about 10 metres from. 10 metres being the minimum focusing distance of the lens. And I'll just start by framing the shot and getting the bird feeder into focus. This is the view through the viewfinder of the camera, by the way. I then take a reading with my light meter. So at 2/50th of a second at f5.6. And I'm shooting at f5.6, the lens's maximum aperture, just so I can then use the shortest possible shutter speed, which is what you want for wildlife photography. And then I set the shutter to 250 as per the meter, and all I have to do now is wait for a bird, and I can release the shutter. So I'm just going to take a moment now to review some other photos. So apart from the garden, the other locations were Primrose Hill and South Bank. And there were some good pictures taken in those two places, although generally they were a little bit soft. And I definitely think the bird pictures were most successful, and I think surprisingly sharp. Especially considering I was shooting at the lens's maximum aperture. And I included these two photos just for comparison, and I took them with my Biotar 58mm, which is the lens I have on the camera most of the time. And I don't usually use telephoto lenses at all really, but some of the photos really did come out quite well, so I'll have to try to think of more applications for this setup. This project was a lot of fun, but it did take much longer than I expected. Some of the adapters especially took years to track down, so I'm glad it's all now finally complete. There are many other camera setups from movies which I'm planning to replicate in the future, so do subscribe if that's something you're interested in. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.